So thank you so much for coming today for a discussion. It's really actually my honor to have this chance to talk to you. I would just tell you a little bit about my art practice, just to let you know background to this project. And then I'm looking forward to hearing, I know your work a little bit, but it's also given me a chance to know more about what you do, and then we can have a discussion. I came to plants quite recently. I used to work a lot with people, and I've always been interested in politics. I grew up in Beijing, and for some reason, I think for everyone in Beijing, we're just fascinated by politics. I spent a lot of time thinking about equality among humans. But then just a few years ago, I started to, all of a sudden, start to pay attention to non-humans, to plants. And then I realized a lot of the political ideas that we have developed over the past few centuries are anthropocentric, that are only about humans. So I started to think about how to bring in non-humans to our thinking of politics. So I started to create some works mainly to help myself to think about these issues. A few years ago, I did this project using plants to make the slogan called "Socialism Good." So I recreated this slogan with plants that are living. After we finish the installation, we don't intervene. So the plants will grow, they have their own life and they have their own decisions. So after 2 months, you have a lot of weeds. So the weeds will disrupt the slogan. So the idea is, if we actually let other life forms come into our political realm, maybe something we used to believe in that may seem quite straightforward may not be so straightforward, right? So what does it mean that socialism is good? What does it mean to have socialism not only for humans but also for other beings? So this is a work I did a few years ago, and then 2 years ago I did a work in Hong Kong. It's called "You Are the 0.01%." So this refers to scientists who estimate the biomass on planet Earth, saying if we count all the living beings on planet Earth, we humans only account for 0.01% of the total biomass on planet Earth. So we are really the minuscule of the biosphere, but we take so much land and we use so much energy. Of course, a lot of us, think about inequality among humans, but we probably don't think about inequality between humans and the larger natural world. So I hope this work will help more people to pay attention to this. And so this work here, I started doing this work in Thailand a few years ago, and I mentioned to Stephen, and the work is "Life is hard. Why do we make it so easy?" So the idea came from a TED talk, a TED talk, by a Thai farmer. So there's a farmer in Thailand. His name is Zhang Dai, and he went to Bangkok as a migrant worker, and then he realized that why does he have to work in a big city? Why can't he make a good living in his village? And then he started to, he went back to his village and started sustainable farming, and then became a very important activist in Thailand. So he gave a talk called "Life is Easy. Why do we make it so hard?" It's a very inspiring talk, but of course I was very impressed by his work. But then I thought, there's also the flip side, right? So when we talk about life is easy, I think he's mainly thinking about life is easy for humans. We could make our life easy if we live in the village, if we do sustainable farming. I wanted to expand this idea a bit more to think about, is life really easy or hard? So that's why I flipped the statement, and also invited plants. Stephen helped to grow orchids and ferns, because I want to bring in plants into the discussion. Of course, we are 3 humans talking about this idea still, but I hope maybe because you work so much with plants, you kind of channel the voice of plants into the discussion, right? That's why I want to bring in a scientist and also a local expert on plants and animal life. So we can have a discussion, even though we are 3 humans, but hopefully we'll kind of have the voice of other beings in the discussion. Yeah. So this is just the basic idea of the project. Okay.
Well, as you say, Bo, I've been, my professional life and even before starting out my career, I've been working and studying and being very interested in plants since a little boy, just enjoying gardens in the UK where I grew up and fascinated by the communities that associate themselves in the wild. So different species, different populations, not only plants but animals, insects, amphibians and so on. And yeah, it's interesting to hear your point about how as humans we often have a very prescriptive idea of how things should be politically, and life teaches us that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way, which I guess also rings true with what you're saying about how you can flip the slogan to switch easy and hard and you end up with a different meaning. My work as a botanist and ecologist has shown me that when you look at the natural world, when you look at populations of plants, for example, you may have a fixed idea, a preconception about why a particular species occurs in a particular place. But really it's a very challenging question. Why do certain species occur in one place and not another? And why do certain species associate with certain other species but not others? And the first photo that I wanted to show was, this is actually what struck me as a very simple little plant. This is a species that I studied previously when I was living in Japan. Very unassuming little orchid, just a few centimeters tall. And a very rare plant, and my job was to try and understand its ecology. We wanted to help protect this species. And despite it having this very simple body plan, just being a few centimeters tall, the incredible complexity of this species and why it was found in certain microsites and not nearby, whether it would survive from one year to the next, whether it would attract a pollinator or not. All these questions, one after the other, they just kept on coming to me. And even now, 10 or more years later, I'm still captivated by the significance of this one orchid. So from then on through my career, I've been really inspired by these sorts of ecological questions about what it is about the environment that allows a plant to occur and grow and thrive, or perhaps not, die and become just part of the organic matter on the forest floor. So yeah, now here in Hong Kong, my work involves understanding the ecological needs of different species, particularly orchids. We're keen to help protect these things, because now humans are really a major factor in deciding whether things can occur, whether things can survive, whether they become extinct, or whether they go on and perhaps evolve into something else into millennia henceforth. So yeah, it's that kind of very central ecological question about how species coexist and survive, and now the human layer on top of that, and what we're doing to affect those basic ecological principles about whether species can or cannot survive. So yeah, that's my angle on this, and I try to take a plant-centric view when I do my work. I try to see things from their angle. understand what needs they might have, and they may be very different from how we perceive our position on the planet.
8 to 9 years ago, I love hiking, and I go to the most of the highest hill in Hong Kong, and just like Sunset Peak, Lantau Peak, Tai Mo Shan. And then I was greatly attracted by the landscape. So every time when I go up to the hill, I will bring along with my watercolor paper and do some sketches. I think it is very nice. And later, when I go up to the hill, I start observing the plants along the road, and I found there is something interesting. For example, this one is called 大魚八角. This flower can be found in Lantau Peak and Sunset Peak, and it has good smell, it's handmade. I also love to walk along the streams and start find some orchids, and also I can find some beautiful begonia. I love them and try to take some photos to do records. And then because I love painting so much, so I try to make some painting on them. This is flowers, but my mom said just like a plastic bag, and when we smell the flowers, it's a bit stinky. I love those flowers, not the same with our expectation. Yes. After 2 or 3 years, I start writing the books, collect 50 species of Hong Kong plants.
You know, I want to ask you, in your experience, whether the life of plants in Hong Kong, whether the life of plants in Hong Kong, whether we can say they have an easy life or a hard life. I know this is a very generalized question, but I hope we can start with this and maybe bring in some deeper discussion. Yeah.
Well, I would say first of all that, again, that's a kind of a very human preconception, what is easy and what's hard. And you know, to sit outside unable to move as plants are, once they've germinated and they've put their roots down, that's it. They cannot change their position. And then the blazing sun and the heat, rain, wind, everything, just to remain in one position all the time for your whole life always strikes me as a great hardship. You know, to be able to cope under the strong UV light, strong radiation, we begin to feel hot within 10 minutes, right? In the Hong Kong summer. But some of these plants just sustain incredible adaptations of their leaves to resist the UV damage. And so for me, it's very easy to imagine that they have a very hard life, but that's their trade, let's say. That's their way of existing. So, for example, this is one native orchid species. It's called Bulbophyllum Bicolor. This is now a very rare species in Hong Kong, and we've been studying this in quite great detail in order to help save it. It seems to be declining and perhaps heading towards extinction. And one of the things that we found is that it has a very delicate but very important relationship with its pollinator. You can see it there on the flower. It's a fly. Right. So it's interesting, Human, you mentioned the unpleasant smell of the birthwort, the Aristolochia. Yeah, so this also has a stinky flower that attracts female flies looking for a place to lay their eggs. So in nature, flies will often seek out rotting meat or feces as a place to deposit their eggs. And this interaction, this relationship between the orchid flower and the insect is so highly evolved and so specific that the orchid can now no longer survive without it. It cannot reproduce. And unfortunately, with the added pressure that humans have placed on in terms of habitat degradation, a lot of orchids are collected by people who like to grow them at home. This orchid is now so depleted in the wild that even with the presence of this very particular fly pollinator, the chances of pollination actually successfully occurring is so low So in that respect, the ability to reproduce and to secure the next generation, which is such a fundamental part of all life, I would say yes, this orchid is experiencing that great hardship.
Mm-hmm. But you're saying kind of two separate things, right? You kind of started with saying, if we look at plants' life, because they can't move, then from our perspective, it's very hard. But then I think you also sort of said there's no easy or hard if we don't take that human perspective, right? Because plants, they're born that way, and then I often think it's also, we see it as something that they have to tolerate, but maybe that's something they chose to, is something that they chose to do, and it's actually something that they greatly enjoy. Versus us, we always have to move, and because we don't have the ability to, we actually don't have these skills to be stationary. Mm-hmm. So we actually suffer in the sense that we have to move, mm-hmm. right? So that there's it's also based on perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and sometimes I just want to say a bit more. Sometimes I feel now, in particular, I'm sure you agree, like it's so much joy to be outdoors, to be under the sun, because most of the time, most people have to sit indoor, in their office or in factories or in restaurants, and there's no fresh air, there's no sunlight, right? The constant controlled environment is actually not so enjoyable, at least I think from our perspective, right? So I actually feel, I'm sure a lot of people agree, to be outdoor like this in a weather like this, it would be something really joyous. Yeah. But then you also mentioned the human impact on the life of plants, right? Whether because of what we are doing, we are making the life of plants difficult, right? Because if they can't reproduce, I think for all life on Earth, if they can't produce, it must be something very sad for them. I would imagine.
Yeah, as a biologist studying this species, it was both shocking and also somehow disappointing that year after year of monitoring these plants in the wild, we would never see the formation of a capsule, the fruit that contains the seeds. And so the question was, why is this? What's gone wrong here? Why? Surely all organisms want to reproduce.
So it's kind of like seeing people not being able to get pregnant, and then they struggle.
Yeah,
right.
Effectively, and to try and understand the barriers, what's preventing that from happening.
I think you also mentioned there's Orchid Trade.
Yes.
Still in Hong Kong. Or
yes, yeah. So it's been another part of my research over the last few years. So one major cause for the decline in orchid populations in the wild is not just a general result of habitat degradation, but because people actually actively go out and remove them from the wild. So orchids are collected for two main reasons in this part of the world. One is to grow horticulturally, and the other is for use in traditional Chinese medicine. This is a photo from a TCM medicine store in Guangzhou, over the border, and these are the stems, the dried stems of a particular kind of orchid called Dendrobium. In fact, we use a lot of Dendrobium in your exhibition. So they're very beautiful, and they have these long cane-like stems, and they're purported to have this medicinal value. So I believe people chew them, or they use them to make a tea or a soup, and this is supposed to help overall body performance. But because of the huge and increasing demand, all of these species are being collected from the wild, and now it's virtually impossible to see them growing in the wild anymore.
How about the situation in Hong Kong? I mean, I actually, when I walk around, I haven't seen, I haven't walked as much as you have, but I haven't seen what orchids.
Oh, the orchids are there.
Right.
So I think it's about knowing what to look for. I think is a large part of it. And I know you're looking a lot for ferns.
Yes.
But orchids are often there as well. They may be a little bit more inconspicuous. Right. These kinds of orchids, yes, historically also in Hong Kong were collected almost certainly for this use, medicine. There's also the second issue is this is collection for horticulture.
Right. For people to grow in their gardens.
Yeah.
Right?
So this is live plants being collected and traded in really large numbers. And this happens still today in Hong Kong.
Still in Hong Kong?
Yeah,
Okay.
so if you go to the flower markets like Wong Gok, you'll see a lot of wild collected orchids, which may have been collected in Hong Kong or South China or even neighbouring countries and then brought across borders, often illegally, and traded, and so people can enjoy their flowers. And the trouble is that the everyday consumer is not aware of that trade route, the background where that plant has come from. But it has huge consequences for the wild, for the species in the wild.
I think many of us pay more attention to extinction of animals, but we tend not to, there's not a lot of discussion on extinction of plant species, right? But you already, actually, when you introduce your work, you already mentioned there are some plants that are sort of native to Hong Kong that are quite famous in Hong Kong. But how, do you feel there's a need to pay more attention to the situation of plants in Hong Kong?
I think if the amount of those species drop, certainly we have to do something, maybe planting, just like Dendrobium and also Gastrodia, Athena. They used to make Chinese soup. They think that will be good to their health. So many orchids actually are collected for gardening. Some of them want to collect all species.
I mean, I like plants, and I mentioned I have a little garden, and I think as humans we have this desire to collect things, and also to in a way I think it's also something positive. We want to make our surroundings look beautiful, right? We want to collect beautiful things. So this desire to make our space beautiful in a way also has an impact on the larger biosphere. But I also want to, I start to think about, what can we do, or what we should not do. There are two sides to this, right? Because you were saying about if the situation of plants or animals are deteriorating, we should help to preserve the species. We can introduce orchids to the forest. We can, some places even do rewilding. But I often think it's also about what we shouldn't do, right? So whether we should just retrieve from nature, we try to even leave more space for other life. So there's this sort of the line between the right thing to do and then beyond that line we shouldn't do, right? So how do you think about this this balance of doing and not doing, right? Like when it's time to do something and when it's time to actually not do something.
I think that this ultimately just comes down to a matter of kind of awareness and respect for our surroundings, and I agree it's a mixture of refraining and also actively giving back, so doing both, but both of them depend on a basic understanding of how these ecological processes work and our place in that, and how damaging our actions can be and often are. So yeah, I agree, it's a mixture of both.
What do you think?
I tend to keep the environment, not to do anything. Yeah, until something happened, maybe some development there, yeah, and then we have to protect those rare species and then do the plantation, remove them to the safe place. But I do not think I just want to keep the environment not to do anything is most. This is the best way. Yeah.
I share. I mean, I think I don't know if you draw. I really love that you kind of hike and do drawings. That's the main thing you do, right? You walk around and you see things and you draw things. I mean, that's what I'm hoping to spend most of my time doing, right? So I think there's something in not doing, but just observing and remembering and paying attention to things that may be something we should do more. But I think as a scientist, you are doing research, and there are still things, there are projects that you think probably will address some of the emergencies, right? So I feel I also often feel, I think about whether I'm doing too much or too little, or I'm doing the right thing or the wrong thing, even including doing our project, whether I should do our project or not. Because I think many things we do, there are consequences that we don't immediately think about. So I'm actually hoping the projects I do will carry the sort of message of sustainability, ecological thinking, but I'm also conscious that there are things we do that actually generate waste, including art making, including science, including research. So I feel this is something I struggle with all the time. I want to ask you a little bit about red listing. Right. So you mentioned that you're starting a project to red list species, so that also includes plants.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. For me, I'm involved in using red listing to understand which species are threatened and which are closer to extinction than others.
So have you finished the project? I mean, what is the sense of the emergency to protect plants?
Sometimes it's really stark, when you. It's an invented process. It's a human-defined process of how we're going to measure whether something is rare or very critically endangered or less so. So it's just our attempt to try and understand what's going on. But that aside, when you realise that species that were probably once very common are down to the last population of maybe just a handful of individuals, and you realise, what must have happened for it to end up like that. It's it's quite an eye-opening realisation.
So are there plants that we actually know that are down to just a handful of?
I think there are many.
There are many in Hong Kong.
Yeah. So as Human said earlier, we have more than 2,000 species of native plants in Hong Kong. Currently, it's beyond the scope of the people involved to red list all of them, but different components of that diversity are being red listed. And for the orchids, for example, we're maybe looking at certainly more than half, maybe 2/3 or 3/4 being threatened with extinction.
In terms of how long do you think the extinction will eventually happen?
It's really difficult to say. So some species have gone extinct in the time that I've been working here in Hong Kong.
So you've been here for like 12 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think Human may know this story, but we actually discovered a new species of orchid on the mountain, Daimosan, a few years ago. And it caused quite a stir locally, lots of interested people, hikers, amateur naturalists, photographers, as well as people who may want to grow it at home, as you were mentioning. And unfortunately, the circus that grew up around this discovery, the interest and all the swirl of attention led to its very rapid decline, and it's now gone.
So you discovered this new species, and then they just went extinct.
Yeah.
In a very short time.
So there you go. I mean, that might also answer your question in terms of what we should not be doing.
Right.
And you know, I totally agree with you both that just spending time in nature and enjoying the calm and the peace and doing nothing actually is the best way to appreciate it. Unfortunately, not everybody thinks like that, and so it's all the demands that are being placed on these individual species and the ecosystem as a whole, which is requiring that we do step in and do something.
So you're saying, you know, because I feel for many people who come to Hong Kong, you know, it's actually, there are groups in southern China, in Guangzhou, Shenzhen, they actually come to Hong Kong to hike, right? Because Hong Kong has many good hiking trails and looks very green. So I think, you know, when we walk around in Hong Kong, we feel, you know, there are many areas that's quite protected. So many people pay attention to the situation in Hong Kong, so we actually feel quite relaxed. But you're saying many species are actually on the way to extinction if we actually look deeper into the situation.
Well, that's another component, that the silence and the sense of calm that you get from being in nature is also a bit of an illusion, because all sorts of things are going on actually, just at different temporal or spatial scales than we perceive. So yeah, you know, things are declining or maybe increasing. It's just, it depends on what time span we look at things.
But you were saying, you know, there are species that can go extinct quite rapidly.
Oh yeah, if the pressure is there, then yes, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
The one in Tai Wu Shan is already gone?
I fear so. I've gone back to check on it in the recent years, and I can't find any.
And just preserving them in a greenhouse would not save them, because they
Well,
is
again,
it hard to reintroduce them?
Well, so you know, if I may just show a couple more of the photos that. Yeah. So, kind of where our work fits into this story is that we try to, based on an understanding of the ecology of these species, we then try to help them and either better protect them where they are or propagate them to put back into the wild. So, for example, this is my lab technician who's working with orchid seeds, which we grow in the lab. We can propagate them. Orchid seeds are quite difficult and technical to work with. You can't just put them in a pot in soil and grow them. So we have to do that in a lab, and then we raise them in a flask like this. So they're the seedlings growing in a flask. And then finally, this is an example from Hainan in South China, where we worked with a nature reserve. This is one of the wardens helping us to plant them back into the wild. So this is a process that we can do, but it's not to say that it's easy. This may take many years of planning, and you have to first get hold of the seeds, and each species has its own peculiarities in terms of how easily it can be pollinated. And then the seeds may be easy to germinate or very difficult to germinate. They may be easy to grow in the nursery or very difficult to grow, and then even when you put them back into the wild, they may die very quickly. So you need to understand what they need in the environment to establish and grow. So it's certainly not a straightforward process.
Do you think down the road there could be more people who actually change from collecting things and putting them into their gardens to actually growing these plants and reintroduce them into the forest?
I really hope
Would
so.
that be a path to?
So one of the thrills of working on that project in Hainan was that we collaborated not only with the nature reserve, but we collaborated with a commercial nursery that grows orchids as pot plants, and the manager, the director of that company, he'd been in the business for a long time, and he was aware of in the past how the business was very much about collecting from the wild, growing them on and selling them. And through that he was very aware of the fact that many things were now no longer there in the wild. And he was happy to be involved in a project where we could now start putting things back. So we were using his skill with growing things to actually put back into nature. So I hope that we can come together and it's not about blaming people per se. Very often people don't know what the consequences of their actions are. But by bringing all of these skills and perspectives together and trying to make things better, I think is the way to go.
Actually, I forgot to mention when this project was done 3 years ago in Thailand, I worked with an NGO, I mentioned to you, a local NGO. They grow orchids and then they sell half of the orchids to sustain themselves, and then they put the other half back into the forest. So it's this hybrid model that they're using. Yeah. So I always feel as humans we always need something to do because we don't want to be bored, right? I think we enjoy drawing. I think it's very difficult for me to just sit still and not doing things. But maybe it's about finding things to do that will help other life rather than destroying other life. I think that's something we haven't thought carefully enough. In your experience, what do you think in Hong Kong what we can do to make the life of plants and animals a little bit easier?
I think the most important is education. Yeah, because nearby because of the COVID-19, and then many people go up to the hill, and then they just go hiking, enjoying the landscape, but leaving rubbish, leaving garbage. I think we have to educate them. I try to write some interesting stories of different species. When people read the articles, they know more about the species and try to know them. Hope they can try to love them, yeah, and then enjoy the environment deeply. Yeah.
I mean, I've been thinking actually in recent, just this couple of years. I think when many people walk around, they don't even sense that plants are living beings until you ask them to think about it, right? I think you use the word landscape. I think most people look at the mountain that they see just landscape. They don't see there are actually millions of lives. I think I'm trying to train myself to see when I see something like this, I don't see it as just a picture. I try to imagine there are actually millions of people, I mean, not millions of non-humans actually living and breathing.
I think this is a huge problem. In fact, there's a word for it called plant blindness.
Blindness, right.
So just a general societal...
I sometimes say it's life blindness. Right?
Yeah. And it affects everybody, even people who you expect to be a bit more aware of plants having a life of their own. Scientists and conservation biologists. I mean, quite often, how often do you hear people refer to wildlife, but in that they don't include plants? They think of wildlife as only animals, as if plants aren't alive.
Right.
So I think it goes right the way through, and I think unless we change that and get over this plant blindness, I think it's going to be very difficult for people, as you say, to look at a mountainside not just as an inert background, but a lot of life.
Yeah, and they're breathing.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think I'm still training myself. I don't think it's, I don't think I'm even there because I still have to remind myself when I see a mountain, I think, you're talking about education. I think, I've been educated to see this as still life or landscape painting and not seeing it as a living ecosystem. So I think it also has a lot to do with how art is defined in a way. I enjoy working with living plants precisely because I feel in the art world, we also need to change the way we think about what is art, right? Whether we are just representing things, and what actually means to represent in just the pictorial way or in the political way. Yeah.
Well, I just think one thing I've enjoyed working on with this project with you, Bo, is just that vibrancy of recreating small epiphyte communities and putting them onto words, and so it is a connection between humans and nature, and words is a very necessarily human thing, but having them as living objects or living entities, and they have their life of their own, and I think that's a nice marriage of us in the landscape.
Yeah, I'm very grateful. Stephen and his colleagues helped to grow the orchids and put them on, and then the tree team helped to settle the words. I'm actually hoping the words will stay a bit longer than just the exhibition, so they can grow more into the environment, so they will actually settle. Thank you. Yes, thank you, Stephen.